Before we dive into today's episode, please note the views and opinions shared by our guest are entirely his or her own and do not reflect the positions of any organization with which he or she may be affiliated, past or present. All insights represent his or her personal perspectives only.
Welcome back to Governance Unplugged Internal Audit Risk and Controls. You are listening to part 2 of my conversation with Martin Studer. If you have not yet listened to part 1, I recommend starting there as today's episode follows seamlessly from where we left the discussion. In the second part, we build on the themes from the first episode and move further into how internal audit can create impact, foster trust, and work together with the other lines of defense. Let us join the conversation with Martin. During the pandemic, Martin, you predicted that up to 80% of what internal auditors were doing would soon be replaced by alternative intelligence. Now in 2025, you believe that your prediction largely came true. What have you seen that confirms it, and what surprises you most in how fast or slow the change has unfolded?
Probably I was wrong at that time with my prediction. It was closer to 90%. But already back then, it was so crystal clear that the early proof points on artificial intelligence, I call it alternative intelligence, would replace a lot of what humans do. I made that prediction to my team and they found it quite, inappropriate, in fact. On the other side, I saw that boards, in so many cases, got audit inputs too late, it was too little, it was poorly delivered, it was inconsistent in the quality of the work and the way it was framed or written. So how can someone be really happy with that kind of deliverable when the management-driven activities to serve clients had to develop a proficiency level that was so different from only 5 or 10 years ago? And I think that was really driving my claim. Now we know it's 2025. Artificial intelligence can do essentially almost everything humans can do. It frames better, it writes better, it considers more data if you develop the prompts accordingly. Yeah, I think every audit function should look down on themselves and say, what's the percentage of our budget that goes into technology? And what's the percentage that goes into humans? How did that threshold change year over year? Let's go 5 or 10 years back and today. And I don't talk about software packages. I talk about really advanced technology. So how did the quality of our auditors change? Do we have behavioral scientists who are trained and certified internal auditors? Do we have data scientists who have helped in great universities to develop algorithms, things like that, who are trained internal auditors?
Do you have a number in mind of what today should be the split between investments into your people within the team compared to investments into new technology?
Well, the work I do in my own company right now, which is not an audit company, it's we invest, but I would say 10 years ago, I would have had the need of 10, 15, 20 people in my group, and we don't need them. So the point is the same. You don't need audit. What do auditors do? If you break down what they do in a year, let's say they have 1,600 hours. How much of that time goes into finding data, grouping data, and writing down observations, reviewing what others wrote down in observations, fixing it, and all of that. You can entirely replace that. So I would say to your question, 80%.
80% in advanced technology.
Yeah.
It's very interesting to have this conversation and to think about that.
I would recommend that boards ask exactly this. They would measure the quality of internal audit by the quality and timeliness of the inputs they can use for their decision making. If you would interview an audit committee chair or the entire audit committee or the board and would say how much of your decision making was truly influenced by timely internal audit inputs. If they would say, wow, good question, I have to think about it, then you know that the audit isn't reaching their potential.
So you're saying that boards should demand this level of digital maturity. What does good governance look like in practice to drive this change, and how should audit committees hold chief audit executives accountable for advancing towards this AI-enabled operating model? Like a side question to that question, I would also like to ask, do you envision the future of internal audit function as being very small, maybe just one or two people, and you just mentioned only 20% of the budget from the past, and that they heavily rely on data, on artificial intelligence, combined with deep organizational insights and a strong communication skills to the board, operating with continuous and direct access to the board and maybe also the senior management?
So I think governance does not have to be changed, but internal audit in some way and the head internal audit in some way occurs, at least in a certain time frame, to sit on a monopoly. It's hard to replace. That's easier in management ranks where there are several individuals who can manage and maybe even rotate from one department to the other. In internal audit, that's very hard to do. So they sit on a certain monopoly, which cannot be resolved easily. From a governance perspective, it starts with bringing the right head of audit into the company. It's about having a consensus with management on this policing versus gelling with management balance. And then it's to really stretch the innovation and development ambition and delivery of the audit function. So if an audit committee head feels that what they get feels somehow strange and old-fashioned, probably it is strange and old-fashioned. If the reports still look and read like 5 or 10 years ago, maybe even in the same templates, they should know, and they do know, by the way, that they get just outdated stuff. So I think that's really the basis. Governance should flow exactly the same. Audit committees should hire the auditor. The executive, meaning the CEO, should have an input into the audit committee chair's decision-making on the capacity of the head of group audit, or maybe some of the more, in a larger group, the directors of within the audit function. Not to define the salary or promotion or demotion, but to have a strong voice into how it feels to work with internal audit. And the audit committee chair should direct that conversation to explore and find out whether these comments point to an audit function that is mastering that, standing as a referee somehow outside and not being always friend with management. So that's the governance element. And I'm also here, I was lucky and maybe blessed that it always worked out for me exactly this way. I felt that management and the board played this balance extremely wisely to the benefit of the organization. So I experienced that this can work. So that's really, I think, what is important. And then you need to be held accountable to those development. Running an internal audit function is not different from running any other function. And at one point, I even wrote for the ECIAA Insurance Committee, I wrote a balanced scorecard paper, how to stay aligned as an internal audit function with the organization, where I broke that ambition down into KPIs and different spheres of running the internal audit function. I think it's a function like any other else, just contributing to the audit committee, and that's how I would look at it.
Martin, in one of our earlier conversations, you described internal audit as a Sherpa guiding a mountaineer up a difficult mountain. That image fits perfectly with what you just have been saying. Could you walk our listeners through this analogy and explain what it means in practice for internal audit to act as a kind of a Sherpa for the organization?
Yeah, I expanded before on that referee analogy and Champions League match. It's a similar one is this one. Again, the Sherpa doesn't earn as much as the celebrity mountaineer, but he knows how to get there. So his advice is not academic. They know exactly the risk. They want to survive. They do it as their job to take risk from the equation. I think their contribution to the success is in keeping the mountaineers safe while the mountaineers have a clear goal to reach the summit. And in doing so, they look the same, they are equipped the same, they smell the same, they eat the same. It's all the same. So if I once had an advisor to myself, a coach I hired to help me to prepare for a new job. And she said, if you'd like to be a mountaineer and you aren't, you need to hang out with mountaineers. And over time, you will start equipping yourself the way they do. And you start sitting in the same cabins and talk with them. And eventually they will take you along and ask you to follow them. So I like that analogy. And so that's how this share processing arrived in my vocabulary. It's about being humble, knowing your role. You're not there to be the CEO, but you've got a role to play to make the organization, including the CEO, a bit safer and more. Ultimately, it's management who takes the decision, it's clear, or the board. Your role is to guide them when the risks go beyond limits.
You say that audit departments often didn't keep up with the change that is going on around them. So why do you think the profession, despite seeing the storm coming, has been so hesitant to reinvest in itself? It's cultural, structural, or maybe even psychological?
You know, it's hard work to transform if there is no specific ask to transform. And the temptation is high to just work through your audit program, and then next year, as you should prepare for a next risk-based plan, to just kind of take last year's as a basis for a high-frequency, low-risk coverage, and then to add certain elements. It's the nature of humans. It goes back to Kahneman. You need to have someone who puts the right amount of guidance and pressure on you. And I think that's sometimes missing in the audit profession. Who inspires a head of internal audit to go the extra mile? If the outcome could be that they annoy management and make themselves not liked, it's hard to be an auditor. I always would say, as an auditor, you need to like people, but you need to cope with the fact that you are not always liked when you do your work. But you need to remain somehow likable. So that's a difficult equation to balance. And if you do that again and again, year over year, it can make you tired. So I don't recommend to stay a lifetime in an internal audit function. I don't recommend as the head of group audit, head of internal audit, to stay there for longer than maybe maximum 8 years, because it's unavoidable that at certain point you get tired. And either you start to adapt the direction management wants to take, or you become a cynic. It's hard to do that role for too long. And that's why I also mentioned before, ideally you can do it in the beginning of your career, at the end of your career. Eventually, once in between is fine as well. If you already developed the internal audit instruments and professional tools and mindset, but that's it. It's a hard work. It's a hard job, very exhausting if you do it right.
Martin, you mentioned no, there was no specific ask for change. Who should ask for that change? And I'm asking because I think it should be the head of internal audit, not being asked to change, but who should be proactive in thinking ahead and proposing change to his stakeholders and explain why. How could a change look like, and what would be the value created out of that change? What I observe out of my own experience is that boards, in some cases, are not exactly sure themselves what exactly they want from internal audit or what's the value they can or they could get out of internal audit. So who should take the first step? Is it the head of internal audit who should make a plan and go to the board, or should it be the board who goes to the head of internal audit and asks for this change?
Yeah, it sounds a bit like the egg or the hen. What was first? Mm-hmm. From a governance perspective, it's the board. As a board, you need to know, why do you spend so much money for a service you do or don't use? Does it make your life better or worse? Do you enjoy the interactions with the head of group audit? It must come from the board. So if the board doesn't know what to do with internal audit, yeah, then that's what they get. I experienced audit committee chairs and chairpersons from boards who really wanted to get the very best out of the time and money they invest. Look at it from the perspective of a board member. They have a lot of work to do with very little time. They get, for a board meeting at a group level, maybe 350 pages a week ahead of the meeting. They, as the chairperson of the audit committee, they have one-on-one meetings with a number of business line heads, with the CFO, maybe with the head of control, with the head of compliance, and the head internal audit. So if the head internal audit doesn't give too much value into these interactions in very condensed time, they will just not make it onto the agenda. And then you can measure how much speaker time does the head internal audit have in preparing for the audit committee meeting, and how much presence do they have during the audit committee meeting. And if that becomes marginal, or the head internal audit is only invited in for 10 minutes to deliver his or her report, then you should know it's probably a low value activity. So as the head of internal audit, your ambition should be to enhance the space you get. And you do it through meaningful interaction, both with the management and with the board. And so it's a simple threshold. It's a simple KPI you can follow. But if you get satisfied by less and less face time, I know of audit functions who only get board or audit committee presence once a year to present their audit plan for the coming year. And the only questions that get asked are, could you do it a bit cheaper, maybe? Do we cover all the important risks? Thank you. Okay, you will understand. We wish you a nice year. What's the value of that? I don't think so. There is too much value in it.
If you get 10 minutes on the agenda, but in fact you have 2 or 3 minutes, if it sometimes happens, how would you start? Probably not with your audit findings, but probably what really matters for them.
Yeah, definitely. And 3 minutes for an audit committee session is really insufficient, obviously. I think we would all agree on that.
Mm-hmm.
I trained, in one of my roles, I trained the entire audit team to talk like TED. So we gave them TED training. And that was only the starting point. From there, we said our audit reports must be structured and read like the front page article of a Financial Times edition. And obviously you have the title line that is an eye catcher. You have to have the lead into it, which is a few lines. And then you have maybe some appetizer before it guides you into later blocks of the newspaper. And we trained that. So you need to bring your most important message in words that resonate with your audience and trigger some reactions. You need to have your elevator pitch in that sense to then trigger their interest, and then they give you time. It's unavoidable. They will give you time because you made it relevant. It arrives at a point where the head of the audit committee told the audit community we had there, your audit reports are sexy. And what you wanted to say is it attracted us to read it and to understand it and to interact with it and to act upon it. That was the best, I think she could say to a group of auditors.
Any one advice to our listeners of how can you turn an existing internal audit report into a report that is sexy?
You need to start with the title line in mind. If you only have the 3 minutes you gave, take a news speaker. How many news do they pack into 3 minutes? Maybe 5 elements. So if you speak 3 minutes, my rule of thumb is 85 words per minute. So 3 minutes is 250 words. So can you bring down your message, 3 elements of your message into 250 words? Write it down. Most people struggle. They not even write down what they want to say. So I would stick to that. If you arrive at 500 words and you know you will get 3 minutes, you will not convey any message.
Coming back to what you said earlier, choose your team, the board or the management. So you draw a very clear line when you say either as the head of internal audit, you have to decide upfront to be part of the board team or the management team. In practice, I see many of peers who report formally to the board, but yet they do mirror actually all the communication and information at the same time to the executive committee. How do you view this approach of trying to be well seen in both teams? Is this a smart way of serving both sides, or does it ultimately dilute the clarity and impact of the head of internal audit role? Is it also depending on the size of an organization?
It is, obviously, but it's also a matter of your own, how you define your role as the auditor. And do you want to be liked, or do you want to be likable and can accept that you're not liked? I made that comment before. I think that's a good kind of way to understand where you stand. And I once told a head internal audit who was about to take the office as the head internal audit, and I said, there is one really important decision you have to make in your life as a head internal audit. Only one. And he said, wow, what is that? I said, before you get your company badge, you must decide in which team you really are anchored. In which, are you part of the team board, or are you part of the team executive management? If you play in the team executive management, you may lose some of your value for the board, or eventually all of your value. And if you play in the team executive board of directors, then you may accept that you don't present yourself as a candidate for an executive management role, because you're not really mingle enough with management or socialize with management. And I think that is the most important decision. I don't judge on anyone who takes one or the other decision, but it has implications on the effectiveness and impact internal audit can have.
Your point about the human conditions of the auditor and the need for ethical, emotional, and intellectual resilience. If you accept that internal audit requires this rare profile, how do we build and cultivate it? Maybe also extend this question to where do even the future internal auditors come from if artificial intelligence is more and more replacing the work the former juniors have been doing? In practice, what can boards or chief audit executives or CEOs do to create and cultivate where this courage and clarity can thrive, rather than slowly be eroded by politics, comfort, or career fear?
No business can exist without politics, so we can't fully remove it. I shared a few experiences where I was lucky enough to have generous managers or leaders who helped me to recover or remove from myself from things I didn't get right. It's a cultural thing, and I think you create strong auditors in a strong culture, where failing is not encouraged, obviously, but where when it happens for the right reason, it's approached with a certain deal of generosity. And I've worked essentially in such environments, and I would encourage to see this happening. This doesn't mean that you should repeat your errors and failings again and again. I think that would be something that should get addressed, and eventually you would be the wrong person. But it's a cultural element, and I think to see that you can fail and don't get just executed, an environment where it's okay to stretch sometimes beyond your pay grade or experience level. There are tools for it. I talked about idea meritocracy. When COVID hit, we had 18, I think, or 20 teams in different countries. And those who were closest to corporate center obviously had some benefits because they didn't lose all their coordinates to the decision makers. But those who were more remote in small teams, eventually, they felt quite abandoned from day one. And then we introduced this idea meritocracy idea where everyone should volunteer for outcomes, commit to outcomes. And if they are considered for that, we would equip them with the tools they need. So we experimented with it, and it was highly effective. We saw people at low ranks to grow beyond others who were much more senior. And the more senior people realized that their impact can only be done through that senior decision-making, involving with the most dangerous, with the most risk-laden questions and decisions to take as an auditor. And it created an environment where people could grow. It was tough, it was demanding, but people who had that appetite to grow could grow. And it takes maybe 2-3 years, maybe even sometimes more, depending on the size of the internal audit function, to transform along such an idea, and then it starts working the desired outcome.
I find it incredibly calming and encouraging that you are talking, Martin, as such an accomplished leader, so openly about the fear of failing across your answers and about moments where things almost slipped out of your control. It shows really that this is part of every real leadership's journey. And I think that gives a great deal of courage to everyone that is listening. So thank you very much for this, Martin, to be so open and sharing these stories. When you talk about alternative intelligence, that's a fascinating term. It suggests that something broader than just artificial intelligence is out there. What do you mean by that exactly? Or is it about a completely different way of generating assurance?
I guess I came to that term probably in 2017 when Harari published Homo Deus, a book which was highly regarded as one of the most eye-opening books on where the future may lead us. So he talked about alternative intelligence, and it resonated well with me because at that time I had no idea what is AI, artificial intelligence, and I really didn't know. But alternative helped me to think a little bit out of the box. It wasn't so clearly defined. So what is alternative? It's if you take a plain vanilla human, that's obviously the standard to start with, and then everything which alters the impact, augments eventually the impact the human can have plays to this. And now 7-8 years later, we know AI had influence into all spheres of our life already, and defines many outcomes of processes that were organized manually somehow or impacted manually or by humans only a few years ago. So I think that's really the essence, to understand that human thinking is not the most advanced source of wisdom any longer, and to accept it and to organize your value creation accordingly. I think that's really what I came to conclude at that time, while we didn't know exactly what it really means. But I think for the moment, when you define that and when it's out, you can't make it unspoken, and you have to work with it. I don't know how the future will look like in 5 years from now. Yesterday, I listened to a podcast by an astrologer, and that was really scary. All that, though this guy talked about decades and centuries, eventually it painted a picture which is very different for human life than we still know it, you and I, and most of our audience. So as auditors, to bring this back, I think it should feel wrong to audit the same way we did 5 years ago. That would be my kind of reality test.
So building on that, what practical first steps should a head of internal take to move from simply trying AI, doing some prompts in ChatGPT to truly integrating it into their audit model, their culture, and their ways of working?
Yeah, it's a good point. I'll give you an example here. In 2019, I think it was, Microsoft Word had this feature of speech to text. And director in my function, she said, we should experiment with speech to text. And she got a huge pushback from the audit community who said, no, that's not possible for 100,000 reasons. It's not permitted. We don't have approval. And she said, okay, is there a group of volunteers who'd like to experiment with it? And she gathered a group maybe of 10, 15 auditors at different ranks and wanted to experiment for 2 or 3 months how they deal and get into speech to text as an enabler to become more efficient. And I volunteered myself. I shadowed it, and I just wanted to find out, what is my threshold? How much more efficient can I become for all things that end in a written text? For example, writing speeches, lectures, editing audit reports that go to the group audit committee, my talk track, these things. Mm-hmm. And the group came back after 2 or 3 months and said it's about maybe a 40% efficiency gain we can achieve for all written outcomes. And then I outlined what I did, and I arrived at 60% efficiency gains. So I could do with 40% of time what I used to do with 100% of time before. And still, a good deal of our audit community rejected that idea. Why? Because it takes maybe 10 or 20 hours of training. And at that time, these tools weren't so effective as they are today. Today, they are hyper effective compared to what it was only 5 years ago. But nowadays, I use speech to text for everything, for WhatsApp, for LinkedIn, for reports I write. It's my standard. So I became maybe 60% more effective eventually as well. So that's how you do it. You start with something small, you play around, you make it a benefit to yourself, and this gives the appetite. And if you do it in a cohort, in a larger cohort, you can automate and augment most of what you do within a year's time at almost no cost, almost no pain. If you achieve that, you can start working on your budget and eventually acquire certain tools that are even more effective and more powerful, and work with some of your IT function or HR function or other functions to collaborate in the deployment of those tools and enablers. So within 1, 2, 3 years, you will have radically changed the equation and the effectiveness and efficiency, and you can replace portions of your budget with more value-adding elements.
Martin, with all this alternative intelligence already being here, even more to come, where do you see the human edge still mattering most? Is it judgment? Is it empathy? Is it ethics? Is it something else?
I think it's really in the way you see your role to interpret, to translate into text that is understood by the board. So you're the storyteller, the chief storyteller, not based on anecdotes, but based on facts. So you help the board or the audit committee chair or the entire audit committee. You are maybe the most senior prompt engineer at the front end, and at the back end, you enable the connection of all the data pools within the company to allow technology to do their magic. A lot of what I did in my last large internal audit role, nowadays I would call myself the prompt engineer.
You witnessed internal audit evolving from a control checking functions to one that aspires to provide real assurance. What does real assurance look like today? Is it about data? Is it trust, or is it influence?
It's ultimately in making a place safer. That's simple, yes. If you buy an insurance policy, for example, you don't know what may happen to you. You don't know how the weather events may evolve over time, but you hope that the insurance policy will have your back once the trouble happens. And if then the insurance company would go back to you and say, sorry, we excluded that from the language, you haven't seen it, then you would feel somehow cheated for all the premiums you paid and the trust you gave. And the same is true in internal audit. If a risk materializes and the auditor says, it wasn't part of my plan this year, I would test it next year. I think as a board, you feel somehow cheated and left alone. So you don't expect the internal audit to always take all the blame, but to be honest in that dialogue and to enter a constructive conversation on what needs to be addressed. Now, for the past 20 years or 30 years, we saw new types of risk becoming more prominent. First, it was maybe internal control. Then it was maybe some human factors of diversity, inclusiveness could become a risk. Then you saw things like geopolitical risk. Then came the cloud, IT risk. Now comes AI. And so the risk landscape changes. Now we have maybe nature risk. We have biodiversity becomes prominent. Well-being is a new type of risk. Audit needs to be adaptable to include risk exposures as they emerge and adjust their headcount and the skills and competencies and tools to do their job. The times when you just could do a compliance control testing over core processes has gone.
How can internal audit communicate this value to leadership in a way that truly lands with the senior leadership of an organization?
You need to feel their pain. I give an example here. Many audit functions at one point in time in a year, they come up with an internal controls consideration for the entire company. If they do that, let's say in March, it may be valid input, but it's the wrong time. You need to understand, when does the board discuss internal control? Maybe they do it in December. when the external auditor come in with their midterm interim audit results and guide on their year-end audit approach, saying we depend so and so much on internal control or on substantive testing. If you don't go in as the internal auditor with your perspective, well-rounded group-level perspective to counter or to support, you're too late. Sorry, you will not have an impact. You may say later in the year, well, I warned the audit committee. I brought all my control considerations forward. Yes, in March. There is no use for that. It's too late. So I think the point is you need to understand the board's pressure. You need to understand their agenda, how they structure the entire year, and you need to organize your shop to deliver to their needs. And that's difficult if you come from a more inert kind of linear audit delivery. Then you will deliver linear audit reports from the subsidiary straight to the board. They are oftentimes not interested in that. You need to consolidate it into a group message, taking all the data points from all the subsidiaries for the entire year and eventually extrapolate and correlate it with other observations to then arrive at a message that deeply resonates with the board.
I really like how you put this, that you need to understand the pain points of the board in order to provide value towards these pain points. And I think telling meaningful stories or packing this information into stories is really one step to get an ear from the board member to really listen to you and to bring your points across. And not only once a year, but having like an open door, at least with the chairman of the audit committee, and having this continuous communication with the board. Many still see the 3 lines as a strategic hierarchy. Some argue it should now be a network of connected intelligence. Do you think the model itself has reached its limits, or can it be reimagined for a digital and data-driven world?
I think it's still a model, and we discussed that before. It's nothing more, it's nothing less. I find it suitable as such. Important is to let internal audit do their job from an independent position. And we discussed why this is so important. It constitutes the existence and the right to be there for internal audit. If you take this away, the world will be a worse world in that sense. So the art of organizing an organization is not to debate really the demarcation line. It's about allowing an independent function to do their work and equip them with the tools that are needed to truly drill into the risks and how these risks are addressed within a company.
So then let's move to the next question. Now that you are engaging internal audit from the outside as someone who actually hires or commissions audit, how has your view changed? What do boards and executives most often misunderstand about what internal audit can or should deliver?
The IAA gives a framework which includes assurance and advisory. And I think this can be confusing. It's more desirable to call yourself an advisor, eventually a trusted advisor, than an assurance provider. So I think it's confusing, and also sometimes confuses the board. It confuses management. You can't do both with the same quality. And I think the more value you add, you add more value through the assurance lens, and if you deliver it in a good way, management and the board want to know more, want to engage more with you or with your team. And that becomes then kind of an advisory conversation, which is rooted in assurance work. I guess that's how I would frame it. Assurance needs to have the right of way.
So, Martin, if I hear you correctly, you are saying that in some organizations, the executive committee may on purpose keep internal audit busy with advisory work in order to keep them away from providing the kind of clarity, timely assurance that the board actually needs?
I wouldn't go so far because that would suggest a bad intent. If I put pressure back on internal audit, I would say internal audit was just too weak.
To round that up, what would you advise a chief audit executive to do differently today to truly earn board-level trust?
Yeah, to bring in maybe another perspective, building on what we already discussed. As the head internal audit, it requires to be a bit humble and to understand your role. Don't try to be more than you are. Don't try to be something different you are not. I think it goes down to this. Even if you are an accomplished executive turned internal auditor, try to be what you're asked to do and accept that you are nothing else. And I think if an auditor starts to feel alone or lonely and then tries to behave like management and take management jargon, and then they lose their edge. So what I would advise the head internal audit is be very clear about your role and strive to be respected through your merits you earned, to entertain a good dialogue with management, to be seen as someone when teams get into fights eventually that you can help to resolve it in a good way, how you can broker outcomes and understanding, how you can tell stories, fact-based stories that invite for change, that invite for taking action and sometimes not taking action. Not every audit finding needs to be acted upon. So give a frame of understanding on materiality. That's the role of the head internal audit. The more you do of that, the more you will be respected, the more value you will add overall.
Martin, this has been such a rich discussion already today. We already spent almost 2 hours discussing, and I probably got to cut our conversation in 2 or even 3 sub-episodes of this conversation, but it was extremely interesting to listen to you. You have painted a picture that challenges a lot of traditional assumptions about how assurance is done and what it could become. We will continue our conversation in part 2, where we're going to cover an all-new topic. We're going to explore the next frontier of governance and how AI, trust, and intelligent risk management are reshaping assurance from the ground up. So, Martin, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Thomas. It's been a true pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot.
So, stay tuned for the next episode with Martin with the title Beyond Audit, Intelligence, Trust, and the Next Frontier of Governance. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave a rating, and share it with your friends and colleagues. You can also find more episodes and resources on www.keystone-governance.ch or follow me on LinkedIn for future updates. And as always, let's build smarter, more resilient organizations, one conversation at a time. Stay bold,